The Swan of Somerset Place, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins at Somerset Place, where 6 graceful swans glide across a tranquil lake. To everyone else, they are a picture of peace, but Miss Marple notices that beneath the calm waters, an old secret is about to surface. Before we uncover the truth behind the Swan of Somerset Place, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales.
Chapter 1. The Swan at Somerset Place. The village of Ashcombe Hollow had always regarded Somerset Place with quiet admiration. Standing beyond a broad stretch of meadow and overlooking a peaceful lake, the old manor possessed the kind of dignity that only centuries could provide. Its pale stone walls had weathered countless winters, while ivy climbed patiently around tall windows that reflected the changing seasons. Every visitor remembered the gardens, where winding paths disappeared beneath ancient oaks and late roses continued to bloom long after summer had faded. Yet more than the house itself, people remembered the swans. 6 magnificent white swans drifted across the lake throughout the year, moving with such effortless grace that the villagers often joked they belonged to the estate more surely than any member of the Ashcombe family. It was a pleasant story, repeated so often that nobody thought to question it, and like many village traditions, it became accepted simply because it had always been there. Miss Jane Marple had heard those stories on several occasions, although she had never visited Somerset Place herself. That changed when a carefully written letter arrived one damp October morning, delivered by the village postman with the usual cheerful greeting before he continued along his rounds. The elegant handwriting belonged to Lady Eleanor Ashcombe, an elderly widow whom Miss Marple knew only through mutual acquaintances. Lady Eleanor had always been described as practical, generous, and entirely free from fanciful ideas, which is why one particular sentence immediately caught Miss Marple's attention. Lady Eleanor wrote that she hoped Miss Marple would accept an invitation to spend several days at Somerset Place because she believed one of her swans had witnessed something that everyone else had failed to notice. It was a peculiar remark, especially from someone not given to exaggeration, and Miss Marple found herself reading it several times before quietly folding the letter and placing it inside her handbag. Experience had taught her that sensible people rarely chose unusual words without a very good reason. 2 days later, she traveled through the Somerset countryside beneath a sky filled with slow-moving clouds that allowed only occasional patches of sunlight to reach the fields below. The narrow lanes twisted gently between old hedgerows where autumn leaves had gathered in thick golden drifts, and every few miles another stone cottage appeared with smoke rising peacefully from its chimney. Nothing about the journey suggested urgency, yet Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that Lady Eleanor's invitation carried a purpose beyond simple hospitality. As the motor car approached the estate gates, Somerset Place emerged gradually through rows of ancient elm trees, revealing a handsome manor that seemed untouched by the passing decades. The house overlooked a broad lake whose calm surface reflected both the sky and the surrounding woodland with remarkable clarity, creating such perfect symmetry that it was difficult to tell where the water ended and the horizon began. Before the driver had fully stopped the motor car, Miss Marple's attention was drawn towards the lake. 5 white swans floated together near the center, occasionally lowering their heads beneath the water before continuing their slow and graceful progress across the surface. The 6th bird remained apart from the others beside an old stone landing close to the terrace. Unlike its companions, it barely moved in all. It simply faced the house with quiet patience, as though waiting for something that had not yet happened. There was nothing dramatic about the sight, yet it lingered in Miss Marple's thoughts for reasons she could not immediately explain. Animals rarely behaved without purpose, and years spent observing both people and nature had convinced her that unusual behavior was often worth remembering. Lady Eleanor welcomed her personally at the front entrance before the servants had any opportunity to do so. Although well into her 70s, she carried herself with remarkable poise, and her warm smile immediately justified the kind reputation she enjoyed throughout the county. Even so, there were small details that suggested recent worry. Her eyes seemed more tired than they should have been, and every few moments they wandered almost unconsciously towards the windows overlooking the lake. During luncheon, she proved charming company, speaking with affection about village life, old friends, and the changing seasons, yet there were curious pauses in the conversation whenever silence settled between them. Rather than filling those pauses with unnecessary questions, Miss Marple simply waited. She had discovered many years earlier that silence often encouraged people to reveal what direct questioning never could. After luncheon, Lady Eleanor suggested they walk through the gardens while the afternoon remained pleasant. The estate looked every bit as beautiful as its reputation claimed. Fallen leaves covered the winding paths, the last roses of the season filled the cool air with a faint fragrance, and the lake lay perfectly still beneath the pale autumn sky. As they approached the water, the 5 white swans continued to drift together in graceful circles, but the solitary bird remained exactly where Miss Marple had first seen it. Lady Eleanor noticed her guest studying the swan and smiled faintly before admitting that its behavior had changed only a few weeks earlier. It had once followed the others wherever they went, yet now it refused to leave the landing, remaining there from dawn until darkness settled over the estate. She confessed that she could not explain the change, although she found herself watching the bird far more than she cared to admit. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Collins, the estate gardener, who had worked at Somerset Place for more than 30 years. He greeted Lady Eleanor respectfully enough, but Miss Marple observed an unmistakable hesitation when his eyes settled upon the lone swan. The expression lasted only a moment before he composed himself, yet it was long enough to betray genuine unease. When she casually asked whether the bird had always behaved in such a fashion, the gardener admitted that it had not. He explained that the swan now remained beside the terrace every evening until well after sunset, regardless of the weather, and although he laughed awkwardly at his own remark, he confessed that the sight gave him an uncomfortable feeling he could not explain. Lady Eleanor dismissed his concern with a smile, though Miss Marple noticed she offered no explanation of her own. By the time evening approached, several guests had arrived for dinner, among them Lady Eleanor's nephew, Richard Fenwick, a polished and agreeable gentleman who seemed entirely at ease in every conversation. He possessed effortless charm and spoke warmly to both guests and servants alike. Yet Miss Marple noticed one curious habit that distinguished him from the others. Whenever the conversation drifted towards the lake or the swans, his pleasant smile became noticeably restrained, before returning almost immediately to its former ease. It was a small change, one that most people would never have observed, but experience had taught Miss Marple that the smallest changes in expression often revealed far more than the grandest speeches. Dinner passed without incident, and as coffee was served, Lady Eleanor quietly excused herself, explaining that she always spent a little time alone in the music room before retiring for the evening. No one questioned the routine, for it was evidently an old habit, and the remaining guests continued their conversation without another thought. Miss Marple happened to glance through the drawing-room window only a few moments later, and once again her eyes found the solitary swan beside the landing. The bird had not moved since her arrival that afternoon. It remained perfectly still, facing the house with calm and unwavering attention, while the last light of day faded across the lake. For reasons she could not yet explain, Miss Marple found herself unable to look away, for she had the distinct impression that the silent creature was waiting for something, and whatever that something might be, it was drawing steadily closer with the coming night.
Chapter 2. The Feather Beside the Music Room. The following morning arrived beneath a veil of pale mist that settled quietly across the lake and gardens. Somerset Place seemed unusually still, as though the old house itself mourned the loss of its mistress. News of Lady Eleanor's sudden death had spread quickly through Ashcombe Hollow, and before breakfast several neighbours had already arrived to offer their condolences. The servants moved silently through the corridors, speaking in hushed voices, while fresh lilies filled the drawing-room with their gentle fragrance. To most people, it appeared to be the peaceful passing of an elderly lady. Miss Marple thought otherwise. She had seen too many deaths that looked natural until someone bothered to ask the right questions. The village doctor completed his examination shortly after 9 o'clock. He found no sign of violence, no struggle, and nothing to suggest Lady Eleanor had suffered before she died. She had been discovered exactly as she always spent her evenings, sitting peacefully in the music room with a china teacup beside her chair. The inspector from the neighboring town quickly suggested that old age had simply claimed another life. Miss Marple offered no argument. She merely listened. People who reached conclusions too quickly often overlooked the smallest details. Once the room was empty, Miss Marple quietly examined it herself. The polished piano stood untouched. Family photographs remained neatly arranged upon the mantelpiece, and shelves of music books lined one wall exactly as before. Nothing appeared disturbed. Even the teacup remained where it had been found. Then her attention settled upon a single white swan feather preserved inside an evidence envelope. The inspector believed it had drifted through the open window during the evening. Miss Marple studied it carefully. The feather was perfectly clean, without the slightest trace of dampness or mud. Considering the wet ground beside the lake the previous evening, that explanation seemed rather unlikely. Rather than questioning anyone directly, she spent the morning allowing conversation to unfold naturally. The housekeeper remembered hearing Lady Eleanor speaking firmly with someone in the library 2 nights earlier. The cook recalled that Lady Eleanor had eaten very little during supper, saying she intended to enjoy only tea before bed. The young parlour-maid quietly admitted that Richard Fenwick appeared restless after dinner and had wandered through the entrance hall several times before disappearing for the night. None of these details proved anything alone, yet together they suggested that something had disturbed the calm routine of Somerset Place long before Lady Eleanor died. Later, Miss Marple found Mr. Collins working by the lake. During their conversation, he admitted he had noticed someone walking near the water on several recent evenings after the rest of the household had gone to bed. More interestingly, the lone swan always followed that person without making a sound, remaining close to the stone landing as though watching every movement. The old gardener confessed he could not explain the bird's behavior, but it had troubled him for weeks. That conversation led Miss Marple back to the terrace overlooking the lake. The solitary swan glided slowly towards a small rowing boat tied beneath the overhanging branches. Curious, she stepped on to the landing and looked inside. At first nothing appeared unusual, but beneath a folded blanket she discovered an empty china teacup and, beside it, a tiny glass bottle with a single clear drop still clinging to the bottom. She made no attempt to touch either object. Instead, she quietly observed the swan circling the boat with patient determination. A moment later, she heard footsteps approaching and turned to find Richard Fenwick walking towards her.
His pleasant smile disappeared for the briefest instant when he saw what lay inside the boat before quickly returning. It was only a fleeting expression, but Miss Marple noticed it all the same. As she looked once more at the little glass bottle, she realized the peaceful silence of Somerset Place had finally yielded its first genuine clue.
Chapter 3. The Swan's Silent Truth. The inspector ordered the little glass bottle to be examined without delay. By late afternoon, the results confirmed what Miss Marple had quietly suspected from the beginning. The final trace of liquid inside contained a slow-acting poison. It was colorless, almost tasteless, and easily mistaken for ordinary medicine when mixed into a cup of tea. The doctor admitted that such a poison would leave very few obvious signs, especially in an elderly person whose death could easily be explained as natural. The inspector's confidence vanished almost immediately. What had appeared to be a peaceful passing had become a carefully planned murder. Richard Fenwick listened to the doctor's report with remarkable composure. He expressed suitable shock. He spoke kindly of his late aunt and insisted he hoped the guilty person would be found quickly. His manner remained calm, almost rehearsed, and several members of the household seemed reassured by his steady voice. Miss Marple, however, noticed that he never once looked towards the lake. It was as though he had decided not to acknowledge its existence. That, she thought, was rather unusual for a man who had grown up at Somerset Place. Later that evening, everyone gathered in the drawing-room while the inspector reviewed the evidence. The poisoned bottle had been found inside the rowing boat. Lady Eleanor had died after drinking her evening tea. The feather discovered beside her chair remained unexplained. The inspector admitted that despite these discoveries, he still lacked proof linking any individual to the crime. The room fell silent. Several faces showed fear. Others showed grief. Richard Fenwick remained perfectly composed, sitting comfortably beside the fireplace with his hands folded upon his walking stick. Miss Marple quietly rose from her chair and walked towards the tall window overlooking the lake. Outside, the evening sun cast long shadows across the still water, and the lone swan floated once again beside the old stone landing. She watched the bird for a few moments before turning back towards the room with the faintest smile. "I believe," she said gently, "we have all been asking the wrong question." The inspector looked puzzled. "We have?" "Indeed. Everyone has wondered why the feather appeared beside Lady Eleanor's chair. It did not arrive there to accuse anyone. It arrived there because the swan itself had been startled." Richard shifted slightly in his chair. Miss Marple continued in her calm, thoughtful voice. "Lady Eleanor always fed that particular swan every evening before she retired. It had grown accustomed to seeing only her at the landing after dark. On the night of her death, someone else walked there instead. The swan approached, expecting its usual companion, and when the visitor suddenly climbed into the rowing boat, the bird became alarmed. It flapped its wings against the person's coat. One feather drifted through the open music-room window. Another remained caught in the sleeve of that person's jacket. The room became perfectly still. Miss Marple turned towards Richard. "When you welcomed me to Somerset Place, I noticed a small white feather caught inside the stitching of your coat sleeve. You removed it almost immediately, believing nobody had seen it. I had." Richard's expression changed for the first time since the investigation had begun. The confidence that had carried him through every conversation slowly disappeared. Miss Marple walked across the room and gently placed a bundle of letters upon the table. They had been discovered inside Lady Eleanor's locked writing desk earlier that morning.
Lady Eleanor learned that money had been disappearing from the estate over several years. Land had been sold quietly through false agreements. Valuable paintings had vanished and been replaced with copies. She discovered the truth only a few weeks ago and intended to change her will after meeting her solicitor the following morning. The inspector stared at Richard in disbelief. "So you killed her before she could do it?" Richard lowered his eyes. For several long seconds nobody spoke. Then he gave a weary sigh that seemed to drain every ounce of strength from him. "I never meant it to happen this way," he murmured. "I only needed more time. She wouldn't listen. She said everything would be exposed by morning." "You prepared her evening tea yourself," Miss Marple said quietly. "You knew she always drank it alone in the music room. Afterwards, you carried the poison bottle to the rowing boat, believing the lake would hide it until you could dispose of it later. What you failed to notice was the Swan watching every step you took." Richard looked towards the window at last. The solitary bird remained gliding silently across the fading light, as calm as it had been on the day Miss Marple first arrived. "It was only a bird," he whispered. "Quite so," Miss Marple replied gently. "Animals don't lie. They don't invent stories. They simply behave according to what they see. People often ignore them because they expect clues to be complicated. The truth is usually much quieter than that." The inspector slowly approached Richard and placed a hand upon his shoulder. This time there was no argument, no attempt to escape, and no protest of innocence. Richard rose to his feet without resistance and quietly left the room under escort. As the front door closed behind him, an extraordinary stillness settled over Somerset Place. It was not the uneasy silence that had filled the house during the previous days. This silence carried relief. The long shadow hanging over the old manor had finally lifted. Miss Marple remained by the window for a little while longer, watching the swans glide peacefully across the lake as the last light of evening faded into dusk. The lone swan slowly left the stone landing and joined the others for the first time in many days. She smiled to herself, believing that even nature seemed to know when the truth had finally been spoken. If you enjoyed uncovering the mystery of the Swan of Somerset Place, be sure to subscribe to Haunting Vales for more original Miss Marple mysteries. Leave a comment below and tell us when you first suspected Richard, or whether the lonely swan gave the answer away before anyone else. Until our next visit to another quiet English village, remember that the smallest clue is often the one everyone else walks straight past.